Okay, today I'm going to feed my starter and I'm going to show you how I do it. It's actually really simple and I do it regularly. I even have my kids do it. So it's very simple once you understand the process. Okay, so maybe some of you are asking yourself, where do I get starter from? Because you can only create starter from starter, right? Well, I do have a method for creating your own starter at home. I started this in June. In my kitchen, I started my own starter. I have a section of the course that outlines how to go ahead and do this from scratch, okay? I also have a document that allows you to get started right now creating your first starter from scratch. Now, with that said, it is much easier not to create your own starter from scratch, okay? There are tons of resources out there for purchasing an already made starter that you just reactivate, okay? I highly recommend this because starting a starter from scratch in your own kitchen is actually not very easy. It takes some time, and I actually threw mine out 3 times before I realized it was actually okay and was fine. I just thought I had ruined it 3 times. But the reality is it's just kind of hard to know what you're doing and how it's supposed to look, okay? So if you can, find a local who's got a sourdough business and call them up and say, hey, can I have some of your starter? Or get online and find a company that has some sourdough starters that you can reactivate. I have some in the link in the description for some that you can find on Amazon, okay? But I would recommend going to someone local. It's a great way to do it. First of all, let's talk about the tools that you need to feed your starter. First, you're going to want some starter that you have left over from your last batch of sourdough. And I have some starter here that's actually slightly active because I left it out on the counter last night after feeding it yesterday. So it has some bubbles in it, but it is my freshest batch. I actually also have here, and I want to explain this. A lot of people ask me, what is discard? This is my batch of discard that I've been putting all my discard into over the last week, week and a half. I bake regularly, as you can tell. So this is everything left over after I take my starter and feed it. Whatever's left that I don't use from this, I put into my discard container. So that is what discard is. It's basically inactive sourdough starter. If I wanted to activate, if I didn't have this, I could actually go to my discard and take some of this and reactivate it. So it's just inactive, weak sourdough starter. It might take a couple feeds for this to activate, whereas this is pretty active because I've recently used it. So this will be easier to keep active and activate. So I'm going to go ahead and use my most recent batch of sourdough starter and show you what I do to keep one of the strongest starters that I know how to keep. And this is where what I know is very valuable because I've gone through it, I've done all the research, and I've lived it. And this is, you can find a lot of information online, but talking to someone who runs a bakery and feeds their starter consistently, very beneficial for you to hear their perspective. So I'm going to show you, these are the tools. I have a scale. This scale is genius because it's large. And I used to have a small kitchen scale that I used. It was miserable. This scale is really great because it's so big that I can put a huge bowl on it when I make my sourdough, and I can still see the numbers at the bottom. And it's actually technically a food scale. You shouldn't step on it because it actually doesn't carry the weight of a human. It's also like a scale used for packaging and things. I will put a link in my description for this or in my supply list. The other tools or supplies that I need some organic, all-purpose, unbleached flour. I it's really important to me to have the healthiest flour that I can. Some people use bread flour to feed their starter, and that's fine. But I found when I use my bread flour, it creates a pretty sticky, tough starter. And I actually created some starter from bread flour to show you. It's very sticky. It's kind of tough. And I don't like that. I want my starter to be pretty easy to scoop up and separate. So I've found that the best way to feed your starter is with all-purpose flour and dark rye flour. And this is the key ingredient. Dark rye flour, any amount of dark rye flour will be the most active ingredient in your sourdough starter. It is known that dark rye flour is the most active flour. So I buy these on Amazon in a set of 3, and I just use a little bit. I used to use about half and half, and I got to where it's like, this is a little more expensive, quite a bit more expensive. So I use a portion of this and a portion of this. And you can always play around with it, like 30% this and then 70% this. Sometimes I'll just put, some in and then do the rest with this. So let me show you how I do that. The other thing you're going to need is a good sourdough starter jar. This jar I found really works great because it has the glass lid. Whatever jar that you use, like I use these mason jars as well, but they're not big enough for my bakery, but they work fine for 1 to 4 loaves of sourdough at a time. This I need for my 6 to 8 loaves at a time. And I actually have another jar of this. This I bought on Amazon as well, and it's a set of 2, and it works great. The most important thing is that you don't have a lid on it that seals, because sourdough expands and the air needs to be able to get out, or you will have an explosion. And I hope it never gets to the point where it explodes so much that the glass explodes, but that could happen. So pay close attention to what jar you're using. It needs to have a lid, or I've heard of people using cheesecloth with like a rubber band. That works as well. But you don't want it open to the air completely like this is, because the top of the sourdough will actually dry out and it won't be as effective. So this, you need to have a lid. I also use the lids to my jars like this, and just place it on top loosely. And then I don't put the ring around it. So this mason jar works with a lid or without the ring, or this works, a glass jar with a glass lid, something like this. So I have linked a few options in my Amazon storefront that you can see what I recommend. There's a few different ones, some that have even measuring on the side. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of feeding the starter. So I'm going to take my jar. I'm going to turn on my weighing scale, and I'm going to make sure it's zeroed out. Okay. On my scale, you push the tare, is what it's called, T-A-R-E. And then I'm going to put my jar on it, and then I'm going to push tare again. So now I've zeroed out my jar. I want to measure only what's inside of my jar. Then I'm going to take my sourdough starter, my most recent batch, and let's say I want to make 4 loaves of bread. So I need 500 grams, and I just know that that's because I've memorized my recipe. But I need 500 grams. I use about 125 grams of starter in 1 loaf of bread. So I need 500 grams of starter to put into this in the end. I need to have 500 grams. So you just do the math. And I always add more because I need to make sure I have extra starter at the end, right? So if I want 500 grams at the end, let's shoot for 650 or 700, or I mean, I like to overshoot it because I always use my discard. So I'm fine having plenty of discard. So I'm going to go ahead and put in, let's zero this out again. I'm going to go ahead and put in 150 grams of starter. Now, a lot of people, they recommend a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. Starter consists of 3 things: flour, water, and starter, which is basically flour and water. So flour and water is what your starter is made up of. But 3 things that you need to pay attention to. 3 numbers. 1, the first number in your ratio is the starter, okay? 1-to-1-to-1 means the equal parts starter, flour, and water, okay? So I wanted 150 here of starter, but I don't quite have enough, so I'm just going to do what I have in here, which will be enough. So this is what you need to pay attention to. 1-to-1-to-1 is an okay feeding ratio. However, it's not the best for maintaining your starter. When you create a starter from scratch, 1-to-1-to-1 is pretty common to see that for creating your starter from scratch. And then even at the beginning of a starter's life cycle, using 1-to-1 ratio is okay. It is going to activate the fastest and rise to its ready point the soonest. However, when you use a 1-to-1 ratio, it's not as good for long-term maintenance. And I will explain to you why that is in a minute. But I personally recommend 1-to-2-to-2 at the lowest, or 1-to-3-to-3 and up to 1-to-5-to-5, preferably. So I often will feed my starter at night, and I will do a 1-to-4-to-4 ratio. And in the morning, I'll wake up and it will be perfectly activated. It took 8 hours to activate at 1-to-4-to-4, or around that. Maybe it was ready at 6, but I was still sleeping. So 1-to-4-to-4 is my ratio that I use because I love feeding my starter at night. Now, if I'm in a hurry and I didn't feed my starter at night and I want to bake the same day, I'm going to do a 1-to-1-to-1 or a 1-to-2-to-2. But that's the exception. Most days that I feed my starter, I want to do a 1-to-3-to-3, 1-to-4-to-4, or a 1-to-5-to-5. And let me explain and show you what a 1-to-3-to-3 is, okay? So I have 1 part sourdough starter, and I had 125 grams. I was thinking I'd get 150 out of this, but I only got 125, and that's okay. So I'm going to do a 1-to-3-to-3 ratio. So 3 times 125 is 375, okay? So I'm going to do 125 of sourdough starter, 375 of flour, and 375 of water. That's how I'm going to feed my starter, okay? So I'm going to take my all-purpose flour. I zeroed this out. I know I have 125 grams in there already. So I'm going to go ahead and put in some flour. And this container is about done. So I'm just going to say I'm going to finish this and I can chuck it. And where in the world is my apron? I'm going to get that on in a minute. Okay, so 188 is how much I had of that. Now I'm going to just do the rest with my dark rye flour, because this is the golden tool to my starter. Okay, so we said 375. I usually don't use quite this much of this, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use it. 375. So just so you know, I'm making a lot of starter. But in my brain, I said I was going to make 4 loaves. I decided I'd rather make 6 to 8 loaves. So I'm going to make 300. I'm going to make, so if I have 375 plus 375, oh boy, now it's stretching my math abilities. 750. 750 for those two. And then 125. So 850, 875. So in the end, I'm going to end up with 875 grams. Okay. And we're measuring in grams. And I don't know if I mentioned that. We're measuring in grams. Okay. And there is a unit button on my scale to change the unit so that you can actually change it to different units. But I am doing 375 of flour and 375 of water. And I'm going to end up with 850 grams of sourdough starter. That's a lot, okay? Most people don't want that much. You can feed your starter with 50 grams of starter to start and 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water, okay? 50 grams is very little. It's like 1 or 2 scoops with a tablespoon. So you don't need a crazy amount of starter to be able to feed your starter, okay? In fact, a cool little thing that I did yesterday was I actually only had this much, which is like an empty jar, and I fed it with water and flour, and that's what I ended up with this morning. I literally just had scraps of sourdough starter. So even if you use up all your starter, you can still use what you have left in the jar to reactivate it. Now, what if you put this in the sink and wash it out and you didn't feed? Like, let's say I'm making my bread and then I put this in the sink. Oh my gosh, I don't have any more starter. That's why I'm going to show you a trick later on in my YouTube channel and in my courses, that you should always dry some of your starter so that you can put it in your freezer just in case that happens, because you do not want to lose the starter. Like it's your baby, right? My starter is named June because it was born in June. So that, I'm digressing. Let's get back to feeding our starter. So now I've got sourdough starter and flour in here. I'm going to add some water. I also threw on an apron. Okay, so I'm going to take my jar here and I'm going to get 375. 375 grams of water. Now, much of what you read says use filtered water because there are chemicals in water. And this is a chemical experiment. If you didn't know, this is a science experiment that we're doing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get filtered water. But I have to say this, I am a cheater sometimes, and I do get my tap water. I have pretty good tap water. I get tap water because sometimes I'm in a hurry, and tap water is warm. And anything warm is going to activate faster. Okay, so a trick to activating your starter faster is putting warm water in. Okay, so if you have warm filtered water, that's actually ideal. But I'm going to go ahead and get some filtered water from my fridge. Okay, so I'm going to put my filtered water, 375 grams, because remember I did a 1 to 3 to 3 ratio. And as I get closer, I kind of slow up because it's really hard to remove water from your jar once you've already hit it. Now, many people say, oh, is it bad if you're off a few, you accidentally dump a little bit more? I'm at 380. I went over 5 grams, but it's going to be okay. It actually doesn't make a huge difference. Now, if you go over a lot, you might end up having to put a little bit more starter and a little bit more flour in just to equal it out. But that's okay. That you can always do that. So don't feel like if you make a mistake with your wing, you can't go back. So I'm just going to mix this up and show you up close. I'm mixing it up. Usually on the bottoms, you can kind of see there's some starter that just kind of gets down there. Okay, so you will notice that this turns out to be the consistency of like a muffin batter. Okay, it's pretty thick. And I noticed very early on that when I put too much water in my starter, it would not activate. So if it's not thick, it does much better if it's thicker. So that's why that ratio is important. Some people just eye it and put in, as much flour and water as they need to get this consistency, and that's fine once you're pretty experienced. But in my opinion, I mean, I still measure for my business, I still measure my starter. So that's what it's going to look like, okay? Very thick, muffin-like batter, okay? And it's going to be a little darker than some people's starters because we used that rye flour. But I promise you, if you ever have a weak starter, put rye flour in it and it will fix your starter overnight. I'm telling you, it's the key. It's the key to a good starter. Okay? So now we're going to put the lid on and we're going to put this in a warm place. Okay, so this is ready to rise. And here are a few little tips and tricks to getting a good rise. So first of all, yeast. Anytime you have warmth, your yeast inside the sourdough starter is going to activate quicker, okay? So if I put this in a spot, let's say next to my fridge, where there's some heat always kind of being generated, I tend to get a quicker rise. I also have a trick, and that you have to be a little careful with this because it can actually get a little bit too hot. But I will put my sourdough starter, if I'm in a rush, only if I'm in a rush, I will put it in my oven with it off, but with the oven light on, okay? And it creates some warmth in there and it will activate quicker. Now, if I can avoid artificial heat and all that, then that's best, I think, because you're playing around a little bit. If your starter gets too hot, it can actually kill the yeast. So you don't want to play too much with like some like really high temps. So be careful. But I will put this next to my fridge. Usually I do this at night, but today it's daytime, so I could demonstrate this. So I'm going to put it next to my fridge, and in a couple hours, I'll show you the result. Where I live in Southern California, it's pretty warm here. The temps are always pretty warm, and even in the winter, my kitchen's not very cold. So I still am able to get a good rise, usually in about 3 to 6 hours from this sourdough starter. If I put it in my oven and do the light method, I can get it down to about 3 hours to give you an idea of how long it takes for this to rise. And like I said, if you do it at night with a higher ratio, it could take about 6 to 8 hours. And that's perfect timing because you'll wake up in the morning and your sourdough is ready to use. So that's a perfect strategy, is to do it at night, leave it on the counter. Now, other things to note. How often do you feed your sourdough starter? I feed my sourdough starter consistently several times a week because I'm baking several times a week. I do not feed it daily just to feed it, okay? That is unnecessary. Some people recommend that. I do not necessarily recommend that because it's okay. Your sourdough still will rise and will still turn out great. Let me give you another tidbit of advice. I have created a recipe of sourdough with inactive sourdough starter or partially active sourdough starter. And what was the result? My sourdough bread still rose. It might have taken a little bit longer, but it still rose and it still tasted amazing. It might have not been my best loaf, but it was still an amazing loaf, something I might have still sold at my stand. So just because your sourdough starter isn't fully active does not mean your bread will not rise. However, your best chance for the best sourdough is to take your sourdough starter when it's at its peak and to feed your bread dough at its peak, to create your bread dough when it's at its peak. You're going to have the best result. You're going to get the best rise, etc. But just keep that in mind. Sourdough is more forgiving than you think. And that's something that after reading all this stuff online and exploring different things, I kept thinking, gosh, there's these hard, fast rules with sourdough. Well, the reality is with baking, there's not hard, fast rules. In fact, you can create your own systems and you can create your own theories, and there are so many out there that work, okay? So this is just a way for you to get started quickly and have success quickly, is to follow these rules. Okay, so I'm going to put this in a warm, dry place. So, back to feeding your sourdough starter. I got on a tangent again. When you feed your sourdough starter, you don't have to feed it every day. I feed it several times a week because I bake that often. But if you don't bake that often, you need to I recommend feeding your starter at least once a week. Okay, once a week should be sufficient amount of time in between feeds to keep a very healthy, active starter. If you go out of town for 2 or 3 weeks, for a month, your starter will likely reactivate. I've seen people that have gone 6 months and have reactivated their starter, believe it or not. It's crazy. But I would not recommend 6 months. I would say if you're within a month, you're going to be okay. I would just feed it a few times before you make your bread to really get a nice active starter, okay? So let's say you go out of town, it's 3 weeks later, you feed your starter. Feed it twice in one day before you actually create your bread. So maybe feed it at night and then feed it again the next morning. And then once it's active, make your bread. But once a week is a great standard. I've gone once a week consistently, and my sourdough starter, I don't even find that I have to feed it twice. Some people still recommend feeding it twice, if you just feed it once a week. I don't do that. And my sourdough bread is delicious. It gets an amazing crumb. It gets an amazing crust. And I'll tell you more about those in my course and on my YouTube, what those actually mean. Okay. So I will link all of my tools that I use for starting my sourdough in my description or in the notes of my course. You will be able to see everything that you need to see for successful sourdough starter maintenance and caring for your starter.
Okay, about 4 hours later, I went to check my sourdough starter, and this is what it looked like. And it is very active. As you can tell, this is what active sourdough looks like. You have holes everywhere, kind of at the top. You can see holes from the sides, little bubbles throughout. This is what it looks like when you scoop it. And you could tell as well that it had doubled in size, and that's what you're looking for. You want it to double in size. Now, sometimes it gets to about triple in size if you allow it to. And in order to truly see the peak of your sourdough, you're going to look for where your sourdough starter rises up and then starts to fall a little bit. And when it starts to fall, it'll leave a little bit of a ring where it reached its peak and then it fell. That is at its peak, okay? But I usually recommend just going about twice in height from where you started. So if you wanted to, you could put a rubber band around your starter, and when it reaches twice the height, then you know that it's active, very active, and has a lot of active cultures in it. If you want to get the most active cultures, you're gonna want to check to see that it has peaked and then started to fall. So these are just a few tips to pay attention to when you're doing your starter. Okay, storage. How do you store your sourdough starter? Well, if you're baking every day, you can store it on the counter every day because you're feeding your sourdough starter every night or every day, and it can go 24 hours. But most people don't feed their starter every day, don't bake every day. So what I recommend is that you feed your starter once a week at a minimum and store it in the fridge in between unless you're baking bread. So store it in the fridge unless you are baking and pull it out and feed your starter.
Thank you so much for being with me today. I have loved sourdough, and if you ask my kids, they will say sourdough has changed our lives. How is that possible that like bread can change your life? Well, my kids are so much healthier. They're so much happier. I have 2 kids that have stomach problems, both of which do not complain of stomach problems anymore since we've started eating sourdough daily. So I also have a really cool method for making sourdough for your family every day. You bake a loaf every day. But guess what? I make my bread once a week for my family, and that's it. But I get to bake every day a fresh loaf for my family. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope you learned a little something about feeding your starter and some of the tips and tricks that I use to create a very active, consistent starter. Enjoy sourdough baking.